What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Fantasy Flex Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Raybon of the Action Network. And this is our best ball strategy episode. Here on this episode, myself and Sean Koerner, the odds maker, one of the best fantasy rankers in the biz, are going to break down all of our best ball tips and some players that we like to target specifically in best ball formats, as well as some stacks. What's going on, Sean?
What's up? Yeah, so week one of the preseason is in the books. Can't wait to see what week two has in store. This is probably the week we're going to see the most starters. So looking forward to this week of action. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. The work's starting to pile up, but I'm grinding through it, and I love this time of year. I wouldn't trade it for anything, because this is the time when we finally get information that can actually alter our projections after they're kind of static for the off season, or just trying to changing based on, he said, she said.
Exactly. We're not just relying on reports at this point. We actually get to see them ball out.
Yep. And, get some injuries, get some signings, get some roster moves. So it's, this is going to be a best ball specific episode. We're going to start out with 3 tips each that we like to use to get an edge, and just kind of how we like to go about, treating our best ball drafts. So why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so my first tip with best ball is just understand sort of, the strategy behind it. Where season-long head-to-head leagues, you're trying to just beat one opponent every week. So you kind of want to focus on raising your team's floor. Whereas best ball, you're competing against the entire league. Like it's going to add up all the points throughout the season, and you have to finish first. So you want a ton of upside. You want to go for ceiling, high variance type of players. And overall, you just want to make your roster have as high a ceiling as possible, because you're not having to get everyone's score every week. You're only going to get the best scores week in, week out. So think of wide receivers like a Gabe Davis, or like Deshaun Jackson in his prime, or like a Marquez Valdez-Scantling when he was on the Packers. Those are like the ideal type of players I like to get in best ball specifically, because again, we're just trying to maximize our ceiling week in, week out, try to just get players that we think have a ton of upside heading into the season. So that's a little bit different strategy I take when it comes to best ball.
Yeah, and to kind of add to what you're saying, I think what you're alluding to is a specific stat in particular for wide receivers anyway, and that is average depth of target. Because I think the deeper downfield on average a player gets target, the more he's going to kind of fit that mold of a guy who's going to be high variance. He might run a lot of low percentage routes, but when he catches the ball, it's usually going to be, a 20, 30-yard gain, maybe a 50-yard touchdown, instead of just, catching like 4 balls for 30 yards or something like that. So you'd rather a guy catch, 2 for 86 and a touchdown than catch 5 for 36 and no touchdowns or something like that. So average depth of target, that's Tyler usually Boyd. The guys that, right. The higher the average depth of target, usually, not always, but almost always, I would say, usually makes for a better best ball pick, because those guys are going to vary more from their median projection. And a lot of times the rankings and the ADP doesn't really differentiate too much outside of a select few guys. And a lot of times in best ball ADP, I feel like it's not necessarily the best ball specific guys that even have the higher ADPs. It's just the guys who are kind of like the trendy, like it guys, like, like certain young rookies or just guys that, people are, like kind of high on throughout the industry. So there is an edge to be had by kind of remembering, like, for example, you mentioned MVS, when he was on Green Bay. I mean, MVS is the best use for MVS even now is best ball. Like, I know he didn't have a great season last year. I think he only had like 2 touchdowns, but his quarterback is Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes led the league in passing. Marquez Valdez-Scantling is probably still going to be a top 3 receiver on that team. And so, Marquez Valdez-Scantling is a perfect example of a guy who you would probably not think about drafting at all in redraft. But if he's sitting there at wide receiver 75 in best ball league, I'll take a shot.
Sign me up for that.
Right. And so kind of going into that, you talked about you want upside, you want high variance. So my first tip is one that I see people all the time make this mistake. And I even got a person who I think the other day asked me about doing this with tight ends, not even running backs, and that is handcuffing. And in redraft, it makes a lot of sense to handcuff because, especially with running backs, they tend to miss, on average about 2 to 4 games a year. So if you can get the backup, especially if he's cheap, you're kind of locking in starting running back production, in the event of 2 separate injuries. And the likelihood to get to the third guy on the depth chart on most teams is pretty low. So it's usually a pretty high floor strategy. Now, best ball, completely different strategy you want to take because even if you have a running back and his handcuff, you're only going to have 5 or 6 running backs on your best ball team. At least you should. You shouldn't maybe 7 once in a blue, but usually it's somewhere between 5 and 7. So you don't want to waste 2 roster spots on one team, same bye, all that good stuff. Like if you have, let's say, Alexander Madison, and you're like, hey, I think Ty Chandler at some point during the offseason or during the season might overtake him, or if Madison gets hurt, I think Chandler would be a workhorse. Well, if you have Madison already, then don't draft Chandler. Draft Chandler when you don't have Madison, because that way you maximize your upside of if Madison goes down early in the year, you get a lot more Chandler than you would have ever thought. You're going to have a unique roster construction. And if you draft Madison, you're probably spending a top 5 round, early round pick on him. You don't want him to get hurt. If he gets hurt, that's gonna already sink your, it's not gonna be good for your team, but it's gonna be worse if you don't have another running back that's capable of putting up production all at the same time, because that's what you're really trying to maximize. You're trying to maximize having, let's say you have 6 running backs, you're trying to have all 6 of them have value in as many weeks as possible. You're not trying to have weeks where it's one or the other, because now it's really like you drafted 5 running backs. You literally just gave away a roster spot by handcuffing. And I've heard people say, suggest it with Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. No, if you draft Isaiah Likely, it should be on the off chance that Mark Andrews goes down in week 2 and you get a full season of Isaiah Likely. That's Isaiah Likely's upside. You don't want Isaiah Likely for the 2 games that he's going to fill in for Mark Andrews. That doesn't help your team. You want another guy, let's say you draft Luke Musgrave with that pick, and he puts up starter value all year, and you have Mark Andrews putting up starter value. That's what you want. You don't want the either or. You want everyone on your team to be able to maximize their upside in as many weeks as possible. So handcuffing, great strategy in redraft, where you can set your lineups, where you can make roster moves, where you can release guys when they're hurt or put them on injured reserve. In best ball, your roster spots are your currency. Those are so important, because the fewer roster spots that you have allocated, to different players on different teams, the lower your upside is going to be. So you want to avoid handcuffing, and that's different. Stacking is different. If you want 2 receivers, 3 receivers on one team, and pair them with the quarterback, that's one thing. That's additional upside, because that tends to be correlated. But you don't want a running back and his backup. That's the opposite. Never do it in best ball. All right, what's next?
Exactly. Well, you already mentioned it, but stacking. I think stacking is critical in terms of raising your team's overall ceiling. So if you have a quarterback, let's say you draft, well, I guess it wouldn't be in that order, but if you draft Stephon Diggs, you might also want to get Josh Allen to pair with him, and then Dalton Kincaid later, because what happens is, if Josh Allen has a really good season, Stephon Diggs and Dalton Kincaid probably also had really good seasons as well. Like you said, they're very correlated, and it allows you just to basically own all the Bills passing game shares. No one else in the league can get those. So it's a great way to really elevate your team's ceiling and really maximize the upside you have. And it's easier said than done, because sometimes you do have to take players a little bit earlier than you want to get a stack. You have to be very strategic how you do it. But at the end of the day, you do want to stack, 1 to 3 pass catchers with at least 1 or 2 of your quarterbacks. So it's definitely something you have to kind of plan out while you're drafting, because you never know if you're going to take the quarterback first or the pass catchers first. But once you do, you kind of know what you have to do. But again, that's a really good way to really elevate your team's ceiling, which is what we're trying to do when it comes to best ball.
Yeah, and to add to that, the way I like to go about it is I don't I'm wary of altering my strategy too much in the early rounds just to, complete a stack that might not even be there, let's be honest,
Right.
when I come back to pick again. So what I just try to do is I usually aim to stack my QB2, because usually that just gives me a lot more uh options, because even if I take, let's say my top 3 receivers are all guys that are attached to quarterbacks that I'm just not going to be able to get because they're all going in the first 5 or 6 rounds, like maybe like Chargers guys or some Bengals guys or some Ravens guys even, or some Bills guys, I guess is a better example. If I then have a wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5, and I know pretty much which quarterbacks are going to be available late, that can inform my decision making
Mm-hmm.
a little more. Like maybe then, if I know Geno's going to be around, I go with a Jackson Smith, the Jigba, or maybe, Van Jefferson if I'm planning on going with a Matthew Stafford. And usually what happens is once you invest in one of those guys, then you can usually get a unique stack by going, like, you don't always have to go the wide receiver 1 and 2. Sometimes you could go like the 2 and the 3 or something like that, get a
Yeah.
unique stack that also has some leverage if the number 1 gets hurt. Or you can, some like certain guys, like if you do have a guy like Cooper Kupp, then Matthew Stafford ain't going to QB 20. So, and most people aren't going to draft Stafford earlier than that without
Right.
Kupp. So there's certain things. It just really depends on how your draft unfolds. But I tend to try to just draft for value with my first 3 wide receiver picks at least. Again, you don't want to screw up your draft early in the early rounds, and then from there I kind of go off of it and say, okay, this is who I think I'm going to be able to stack later on. Maybe then I'll let it influence me a little more, but because I'm usually not going with 2 quarterbacks early. So I'm usually going to have
Right.
at least 1 quarterback that I'm taking that's going to be, outside the top 12 and usually even much lower than that. So that's how I usually like to go about stacking, because I think some people, they get too caught up in it, and like, yeah, it's super sexy to get like, Chase and Higgins and Burrow, but you might you might get like the receivers and then miss out on a quarterback because like all these guys are going high. So it's just a little riskier, and I think it's a little more common. Whereas I think the stacks that are really going to win, it's kind of like regular DFS, right? It's like it's usually those cheap stacks that give you the
Yeah.
correlation and allow you to still stack studs and pay for the production is going to be there, but then take advantage of the correlation with the cheap guys that otherwise wouldn't give you that kind of upside. That's kind
Yeah.
of how I like to treat stacking in best ball as well. All right, my second tip is going to kind of be similar to what I was talking about with the first, but it's essentially always aim for the maximum amount of upside in terms of games. So one thing in best ball is there are certain guys that have, I guess, a reputation as a high risk guy and a high risk high reward guys, but if that's because of injury, I tend to still stay away from, like, a guy like Rashad Penny, for example.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people might say, okay, he's in a committee backfield, so you don't know when he's going to go off, but he also has a lot of upside. So great best ball pick. Whereas I don't really like a guy like Rashad Penny because this guy has never played more than 13 games in a season. And so like the more we like the more larger the sample grows, the more likely it is that he's going to miss games in the future, especially at running back. Same thing goes for a guy that's going to start the year hurt, like Jamison Williams. I don't think I'm getting over on anybody by taking Jamison Williams and he's just gonna win my best ball league when he comes
Right.
back in week 7. Like, I'd rather just have 6 more games of upside from a receiver, even if that receiver is not necessarily a top 2 receiver or even a top 3 in week 1. If he's a guy that I think is talented and maybe could overtake the starter as soon as week 2 or 3, that's still better than a guy that I know for certain is not going to play until week 7. So I'm not drafting Williams, I'm not drafting Kyler, pretty much not drafting Alvin Kamara. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
get that there's a point where they do become valuable, but it's already hard enough to project value and games as it is. Now you're trying to predict exactly the point at which they become, like, exactly at the point at which they become valuable. Your projections are going to be more fallible than you think, and you're gonna screw it up more often than you're gonna get it right. And in the process, you're just gonna drastically lower your upside. So wherever I can, I'm taking guys that are healthy in week one and have the upside to give me every single game of the season, which also goes into why if I have a running back, I'm not taking the second running back on that same team as a handcuff or anything like that. Same thing with tight ends. I just want the maximum amount of upside for each roster slot. And that's 16 games in a 17-game season.
Yeah, that makes no sense. And Rashad Penny and Jameson Williams are great examples because in theory, those are two players that are like ideal for best ball. They both have big playability and high variance. But like you said, you can't, bank on them playing 17 games. In Jameson Williams' case, you definitely can't. So I think that's some great advice because that is another aspect is you want them actually, providing games of value as well. So while they're on paper, great for best ball, the injury risk and with Jameson Williams, the suspension already, definitely reasons to fade them.
Oh, and before we move on, I should mention one more thing. This also applies to quarterbacks because I rather have a quarterback that's I'm like pretty sure is going to start 16 games than a guy who is a benching risk. So like another example, I think a lot of people are like, best ball, great time to take a flyer on like a Sam Howell or a Desmond Ritter. Like even if I have those guys higher projected per game while they're starting, I might still take a safer guy that I know is going to start all 17 games, like a Jordan Love or somebody like that. Because at the end of the day, they're already my quarterback too. So I'm not exactly counting on them to give me like this, like there's just not as much separation at quarterback, right? So it's like if I get 11 games of a guy averages like 22 points a game versus 16 of a guy who averages 18 or 19, there's just a lot more potential. I might need those 18 or 19 a lot more than I like a 0, which I could be getting from a guy who is benched or is not starting the season as a starter or whatever not. So that's another thing. I think you always want to value job security at quarterback because, look at like last year. I mean, it was a landmines all over. Matt Ryan got benched. Carson Wentz got benched. But you know who we liked? Jared Goff. He didn't get benched. Daniel Jones. He didn't get benched. Guys like that who you just kind of like, and sometimes you could just be wrong, and that's fair. But I'd rather be wrong than just knowingly take a guy that I think is going to project for less starts just because he has like a 1 or 2 point per game edge in projected per game scoring, which is really all you're going to have at that point in the draft. You're really not going to have much separation at quarterback. So it really comes down to, again, just those maximizing those games of upside because you can't predict when you're going to need them and you cannot do any lineup adjustments, so you just got to roll with it. So those games become vitally important. Every game and every roster slot is currency. All right, what you got for your third tip?
So for the third tip, let's just talk about roster construction in general. And there's no real right or wrong way to do it, but in general, I like to get 2 quarterbacks. Like if you can come away from the draft with 2 quarterbacks, I think you did good. There are some exceptions where I get a third. Maybe it's an example you're talking about where you start with like a Desmond Ritter or Sam Howell, or you draft 2 of those guys. You're just trying to maximize your chances of getting 2 quarterbacks that play all 17 games. It's not advised, but sometimes you get a situation where you have to do that. But in general, I like to have 2 quarterbacks. And then running backs, for season-long redraft leagues, head-to-head leagues like that, I like to have as many running backs as possible. You know me, my bench is basically all running backs with upside. In best ball, I'm a little bit more aggressive. I'm okay just drafting like 5 running backs, 6 running backs. So I think anywhere between like 5 to 7 running backs is fine. You're going to need them to stay healthy anyway. And then the way to get more than 7 running backs is you're going to be taking a bunch of backups at the end of the draft. We were just kind of hoping the starter goes down. I don't like doing that as much in best ball as opposed to redraft where you can manage your roster. So I like to just take good running backs, have a solid 5 to 6 running back core. And then I really like to load up at wide receiver, like having 7, 8, maybe even 9 wide receivers, I think makes a ton of sense because that's a position that has just the most volatility week in, week out. Typically, you're going to need 3 wide receivers instead of 2 running backs. So it just makes sense to have the most wide receivers on your team. And then tight end is similar to quarterback, where ideally I just want to have 2 tight ends. Sometimes I'll have 3 if I don't have a tight end until, the first 14 are off the board. Maybe that's a situation where I'll get 3 tight ends. But in general, I want to come with 2 quarterbacks and 2 tight ends. And when it comes to best ball, like when it comes to roster construction, I am a lot more worried about buys than I am in regular season head-to-head leagues because you can't manage your roster. So you got to make sure you don't get 2 quarterbacks that have the same buy, or else you have to get a third quarterback. So definitely pay attention to your buys. You don't want to have too many at one position. But overall, that's kind of how I construct my teams.
Yeah, and this is a good time to remind people that there's a lot of spots. Like when you're looking at rankings, like sometimes people ask us like, oh, do you have this guy 16th or 15th? Or do you have this guy 34th or 33rd? It doesn't matter. Like there's yes, there are tier drop offs, and you do a good job of always highlighting those. You have your tiers pieces out where you kind of highlight that. But for the most part, the difference of 1 or 2 or even 3 ranking spots is not much. It's going to be tenths of a point. And so if the buy is a tiebreaker, then let the buy be the tiebreaker. Like don't draft don't like stack up buys on the same weekend. Because again, remember your roster spots are and those like games are your currency. And so if you have a week where like you're just already starting out with 4 or 5 or 6 zeros, there's really nothing you're going to be able to do to replace it. You're just going to have to hope that the 4 guys you have active or whatever are going to have big games, and that's unrealistic. So if you can spread out your buys, do it. And remember, because stacking is something that you really should be doing in every team with at least one of your quarterbacks. You want to kind of save your same buys as much as possible, for your stacks too. So kind of keep that in mind. Look at your receivers to kind of give you to dictate, okay, who based on the receivers I've drafted, this is the quarterback that I'm probably going to draft to stack with them. At least in my case, because I'm usually going with later quarterbacks for that stack. And then you say, okay, well then if there's like running backs or tight ends or whoever else that might also have that buy, that could also be a tiebreaker, because the stacking is also very important. It's going to be really hard to win, especially a larger field best ball league without stacking. You're just going to need that correlation. You're going to need that upside. So that's already guaranteed to have 3 or 4 of the same buy right there. So if you could kind of work from that and minimize the other players that have those similar buys, it's going to work out better. But yeah, if you could spread out your buys as much as possible, it's always optimal. And that kind of goes into my third tip is leave your roster flexibility for the end. So usually, and to your point, ideal is 2 quarterbacks, ideal is 2 tight ends. Now, a lot of people, there's content out there. Our guy TJ Hernandez does some great content on this, where they look at the past best ball win rates and what worked in different leagues. And generally, what you find is exactly what you said: 2 to 3 quarterbacks, 2 to 3 tight ends, 5 to 7 running backs, 7 to 8 receivers. Usually, though, when you see those 3 quarterbacks or 3 tight ends, it's more because somebody did screw up and either they had a similar buy or something like that. Like, the ideal is to have 2 quarterbacks, draft your second quarterback before you get in a situation where you're drafting a guy that might not start the whole year, or before you're in a situation where the only starters available all have the same buys as your QB1. And the same thing for tight end is a little more, there's more tight ends available. So that shouldn't really be an issue. But in general, you always want to kind of have roster flexibility for the end so then you can draft for value at the more important positions, which are running back and receivers. So usually I'm between either 5 or 6 running backs, and what would that be, 8 or 9 wide receivers then? 8 or 9 wide receivers, right? So instead of, I'd rather fill my quarterback and tight end 2 before the last 2 or 3 rounds. So then I can kind of let the draft value dictate whether I go 5 or 6 running backs or 8 or 9 receivers. If there's more value at wide receiver, I'll go 5 running back, 9 receiver. If there's more value at running back, I'll go 6 running backs and 8 receivers. But every draft is going to kind of play out different. And you also may have different team needs that you want to adjust for. Like maybe you feel like you're just a little weaker at running back and you want to go with that 6th running back. You want to give yourself flexibility to where you're not just reaching and taking a guy because you have to. So I always recommend, if you can get your second quarterback and second tight end before the last two, a lot of times you're going to have more flexibility with your running back and receivers. But even if not, like the bottom line is just keep that flexibility open to try to draft for value as much as possible, because there's no right or wrong answer. There might even be a rare instance where maybe a third tight end is more valuable than the wide receivers or running backs on the board. It would have to be pretty rare, but I could see a situation where somebody like, a guy that's like you have ranked like tight end 18 falls outside the top 24 or something like that to like the last few rounds. And, maybe he's a better, like maybe Irv Smith is a better bet than any of these like wide receiver fours that are there. And maybe you draft him, but in general, it's usually going to come down to wide receivers or running backs. And also by leaving yourself flexibility, you can also add to a stack that you have without killing the value of your team. So maybe you're kind of you have a balanced roster, and you have let's say a Jordan Love with Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs stack. Maybe you go and add a Jaden Reed later, or somebody like that, or you go and add whoever the third receiver on a team is. Like I'm pretty sure I added some who was it on the? I think it was like Greg Dortch or whoever was like the fourth receiver on the Cardinals, because I was getting like Kyler Murray stacks and his top three were taken. Like just things like that. You leave yourself that flexibility to really kind of fine tune your roster with those last two picks. But if you just draft like all of your running backs and all of your wide receivers early, you're probably just going to be screwed at quarterback and tight end to where you might have to draft three because you waited too long, but you won't even be able to draft three because you waited too long. So that's my thing, is you try to leave your last running back two of those slots to the last two and kind of go based on the value as it falls in the draft. All right. We know football season is finally back, and that means we got a lot of new listeners, a lot of new viewers here on the pod. Now's a great time to talk about first impressions, and no matter how much you swear that you don't care what other people think, we all know that you want to make a good first impression. For me, that means taking care of my skin, which I'm doing with the help of our new sponsor, Caldera Lab. Caldera Lab has a 3-step skincare regimen that I can do quickly so I can get back to my spreadsheets. You got the clean slate, the base layer, and the good. So the clean slate looks like this. This is your standard face wash. Use this in the shower. Then you got the base layer, which is your moisturizer. And then you got the good, which is a little serum that you can put on at night, and that's going to reduce the fine lines, dark circles, and puffiness under your eyes. Skincare is important, but it does not have to be difficult. 1 minute in the morning, 1 minute in the night, all it really takes to reduce your wrinkles, fine lines, signs of aging, all that good stuff with Caldera Labs. And just for our audience, we have an exclusive offer. Caldera Lab's best offer anywhere. Use code FLEX, that's FLEX, at calderalab.com and get 20% off right now. That's 20% off with the code FLEX at calderalab.com. Make unforgettable first impressions that lead to those magic words we all want to hear. You look so young. You look younger. Get 20% off at calderalab.com with code FLEX. All right, let's close out the pod just talking about some of the players and stacks that we are targeting for 2023. Sean, start us off. Who you got?
So for quarterback, I mean, the guy that I've been targeting heavily all summer has been Anthony Richardson. He was at QB 16 for most of the summer, and similar to your point where he's not a quarterback that we can really project for 16 or more games as a starter. So he did kind of have that downside going in the season. He's more of the reverse of Sam Howell or Desmond Ridder, where as soon as Richardson did start, he's probably going to start the rest of the season. So what I've been doing is taking Anthony Richardson and then having a quarterback paired with him that doesn't have a bye until like week 7. So I was kind of giving myself some insurance to have a guy to get starts with him. But I just love Richardson's upside. He has massive rushing upside. That's ideal in redraft leagues, and it's also a deal in best ball. He's going to have some spike games. But now that he has been announced as the week 1 starter, I think his ADP is going to go up, possibly near the top 10. So that's why I've been trying to really load up on him before that potential news broke. But I still like him as a best ball type of guy because, again, he's going to have massive weekly upside. He has just, top 5 overall kind of upside as a rookie. Those are the kind of players I like to target. So he's been one of my favorite best ball targets at the QB position.
Yeah, he's just going to be an exciting guy to roster in all formats. I'm going to talk about quarterbacks in the stack. So let's talk about some running backs, because I think you and I both kind of agree that there's a certain nuance in best ball and certain running backs that are maybe a little bit more valuable. And I think those are kind of those guys that are going to be in known committees from the jump. So a couple guys that come to mind for me, AJ Dillon, Tyler Algier, where I think these guys are still going to get work even behind the starter. Dillon's case, because that's, kind of almost a 50-50 split. And in Algier's case, because the Falcons project to run so much that even if Bijan gets, 16 to 20 carries, they average, I think, was 27 or so carries per game. There still should be, 7 to 10 left over in many weeks for a guy like Tyler Algier. So guys like that, where you don't know exactly which weeks they're going to necessarily go off, but that they should have value. Those guys become a little bit more valuable in best ball because their production is going to be kind of high variance. Like some weeks they might get like 5 carries for 10 yards, but some other weeks they might get 13 carries for 83 yards and 2 touchdowns or something like that. So guys like that are guys I like to target. And you got a couple as well.
Yeah, same strategy. Like, I love that breakdown. Those are the type of backs I love rostering in redraft leagues and especially best ball. So my 2 are Dave Montgomery and Jaylen Warren, who both are considered, the backups heading into the season, but they're both going to see enough touches week in, week out to produce, some spike weeks, potentially RB2 value at times. In best ball, you won't have to kind of figure out when those games are, especially with David Montgomery. He could have some games where he scores 2 touchdowns, or games where, he just has 8 carries for 30 yards and that's it. Kind of like Jamal Williams last year. So he's ideal for best ball. Plus, all these players that we're talking about have massive upside if the starting running back were to go down. So those are all just the factors that, we value in redraft and best ball. So these are the same types of backs I'm targeting in redraft for best ball, but that's because they just provide a ton of upside.
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of these guys we're talking about, I think especially a guy like Dillon, like, he's in a committee with Jones, but if Jones were to go down, it's unlikely that Dillon would have a 50-50 split with something like Lou Nichols or Patrick Taylor or Goodson or whoever makes that, earns that third running back job. And, that's the case in a lot of these. The Lions, I never know. So I'm not even going to pretend to know what the Lions would do because they're always being weird with it. Like, I think Montgomery's probably the starter, to be honest with you. I think Montgomery probably has more touches than Gibbs, even though he's not, doesn't necessarily mean he's going to have more fantasy value because Gibbs
I should say he's not being drafted higher.
Right.
He's the second Lions running back being drafted is one way to put it.
Yeah, but like with the Steelers, is McFarland going to get like the same amount of carries Warren got if Najee went down? Probably not. Nope. Same thing with Dillon and Jones. Algier, probably not either, because we saw him be, like a workhorse back when he was a starter. So yeah, guys like that in a lot of cases, that's kind of like the best of both worlds. You get a guy who is going to have value that you can't predict, but still going to have, top 36-ish, top 40-ish value. And then if the starter goes down, he may have the workhorse role all to himself. Zach Charbonnet is another guy that comes to mind as well. So yeah, those guys are really the kind of ideal guys to draft in this format. All right, let's so we kind of alluded to this earlier, but who are some wide receivers that you like in this format for this year?
I mean, I think the poster child for this is Gabe Davis. He was the ADP wide receiver 26 entering last season. He ended up finishing as the wide receiver 27, but he was labeled a bust. And I think a lot of that just had to do with the week-to-week inconsistency that, isn't great for season-long leagues. But for best ball, that's fine. You don't have to guess when he's going to erupt for a 4-touchdown game or, catch a 90-yard touchdown. So he's ideal for best ball. He was actually the only player last year who saw 15% or more target share with an A dot over 16 or more yards. I mean, that's just a great combo for best ball. So love him in redraft, but I like him even more in best ball. And another wide receiver that you can get way later with the similar type profile as Marvin Mims on the Broncos. With Tim Patrick out for the season, the wide receiver 3 spot for the Broncos is wide open. So I think we're going to see plenty of snaps for Mims this year. And he profiles as a deep threat. He has nearly the same height, weight, speed, and playing profile as like a Darnell Mooney. So I think he's the kind of guy that he might not see a ton of targets week in, week out, but when he does, they're going to be more downfield. He could make some, explosive plays. So he's going to have some spiked weeks. We don't know when they're going to be, but you get him right around wide receiver 70. And he's the kind of guy we were talking about, like Marquez Valdez-Scantling, where he's way better for you in best ball formats. So those are the two players I target more in best ball.
Yeah, those high ADOT guys, and Mims obviously became a lot more relevant with his injuries. So yeah, he's one of my favorite targets as well. I think I want to go straight into stacks here because I think the receivers are going to be kind of obvious. You can think about there's Valdez-Scantling is another one. I think a guy like Pickens maybe had a little more value in best ball, though I think he's probably just going to be more of a traditional receiver this year, but we know the guys. But I think with stacks, I think here's where it gets interesting. So what are some of the stacks that you've been kind of targeting this year?
So one of my favorite ones in best ball is Trevor Lawrence stack. So Jaguars offensive stacks, because Lawrence isn't a guy I really get much in redraft leagues. I have him as my QB8. That's where he goes. It's not really a time I like drafting quarterbacks, but in best ball, I love getting him there because he is, a generational talent type of quarterback entering year 3. So he could be even better this year. So he has a ton of upside. But I also like where all of his pass catchers go. Like, I think Calvin Ridley has top 10 upside. And by all reports, it sounds like he's right back in his 2020 form. So love him. I love getting, Christian Kirk's one of my favorite receivers that you can get in the wide receiver 30 range. I think Zay Jones is cheap. Love Evan Ingram. So it's just an easy team to build stacks. I was kind of talking about earlier where it is kind of tough building stacks because you're kind of, going with the flow of the draft. I found it way easier to stack Jaguars because I like all 4 pass catchers. And the other stack I love getting, even right now, is Brock Purdy, Brandon Ayuk, and George Kittle, just because I think those 3 players are very highly correlated. I mentioned last year, Kittle was the tight end 1 overall over the final 6 games, which all happened to be the games Brock Purdy was starting. So if we had a different situation this year where Trey Lance was the week 1 starter, I would downgrade Ayuk and Kittle. So the fact that Purdy looks like he's ready to go week 1, he is the team starter, that raises the value of both Ayuk and Kittle. So I think we're getting just a ton of correlation there. And, they might alternate which weeks they have good games, but at the end of the day, I like getting, 49ers stacks with, Purdy, Ayuk, Kittle. You could even mix in like a CMC in a stack like that since he's so heavily involved in the passing game. But I think the 49ers stacks lately have been something I've been targeting as well.
What about Debo? Would you?
Yeah. No, I think that he's a bit pricey. Like, he's a guy that I don't have being as valuable. And, he is a best ball type guy where he's going to make big plays. So, yeah, absolutely. I just think Ayuk and Kittle specifically are the 2 guys that I give the biggest boost to with Brock Purdy under center.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. It's guys that you can get a little bit cheaper to where you're not really throwing off your draft strategy. So a couple of things that I really look for in stacks are, number one, that cheapness. And when I say that cheapness, it's more with the quarterback, because what I really try to avoid is like throwing off my draft early and reaching on a quarterback, which is already a position that, tends to be better off by waiting. So usually a stat, like the earliest I'm usually going for a stack is like a DK Tyler, Jackson Smith, Jigba, Geno Smith stack. Because I look for not just, having the quarterback be at a range to where if I get 1 or 2 of his receivers, somebody's probably not going to take that quarterback. I'm looking for that kind of quarterback. But I'm also looking for teams with average to below average defenses, because that's also when you're really going to see a lot of these stacks hit. It's just like DFS. If a team only allows 10, 17 points, then they're not going to, the need to put up a bunch of offense and keep throwing all these receivers is not going to be as high. But a team like Seattle, you figure their defense, they got some talented guys like Tariq Woolen, but for more or less, like you would expect their defense to kind of top out about average. Another one is, a guy like Jared Goff. Especially if I got Amon-Ra St. Brown early, but even if I didn't, if I can get Jared Goff and guys, because like a lot of times it's these stacks that, again, you would never really consider these guys otherwise. Like I might take a Jared Goff, Marvin Jones, Josh Reynolds stack, or one of those guys with the rookie Sam Laporta. I like the cheap guys, the bad defenses. I think really kind of enhance the value of those stacks. I don't expect the Rams to be very good on defense this year. So, obviously Cooper Kupp, Matthew Stafford, but if I can't get that, maybe a Stafford, Jefferson, Nakua stack, or Tutu Atwell, even a Tyra Higbee, try to get some touchdown equity in the red zone. I think Jordan Love paired with, Watson, Dobbs is a really cool one. That's pretty cheap. You could draft Watson early, and then Dobbs is going to be there. Love is going to be there. I think the Texans, CJ Stroud, maybe a Nico Collins, a Tank Dell stack, it would be very intriguing. Stacks where the team has a below average defense, I think really kind of increases. Bryce Young, DJ Chark, and Jonathan Mingo, because I'm not high on Thielen. So, and I like the fact that Chark would go and Mingo could both go downfield. So those kind of stacks have been my favorite. Like a Kenny Pickett, George Pickens, Deontay Johnson stack is pretty cheap, so I don't mind it. But the only thing with that is I wonder how many weeks it's going to truly hit, because Pittsburgh's defense is probably going to be good, and they're probably going to be conservative. So like something like that, or even the Russ Wilson, Judy Sutton, or Judy, or Mims included in that. Like, they have some upside because they're still cheap enough, especially at quarterback. But the defense, you also got to think about that Bronco defense probably going to be good to where Russell Wilson's not going to have to throw for 350 yards and 3 touch, even if he still can, I don't know. But,
right.
He's probably not going to have to very often. So that's kind of knocks down like the Wilson or the Pickett stacks a little compared to like the Goff and the Staffords and the Loves for me.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think the Pickens, Deontay one makes a ton of sense, because in order for both receivers to really crush ADP, Pickett has to have a good year. So there's just a lot of correlation there. If you think Pickett's going to have a breakout year too, like having both Pickens and Deontay is going to be massive. So I think having stacks like that, especially like you said, with a cheaper quarterback, are the easiest ones to build, and they have the most correlation. So yeah, the Pickett one, especially after how he looked week 1, I can definitely get behind.
Yeah, and with stacks like this, the great thing is, because let's say maybe you get Pickens and you get Pickett, but you miss out on Deontay or something like that.
Yeah.
You can especially if you're giving yourself that flexibility later in the draft, there's nothing wrong with going with a guy like a Calvin Austin. Like, he's a guy who I think could, from week 1, outplay Allen Robinson and become the number 3 wide receiver going forward as soon as week 2. So I don't hesitate to like roster guys like for example with Jared Goff. I might take a flyer on a guy like Khalif Raymond, who a lot of times ends up outplaying like some of the other guys. I would never draft him, individually, and he wouldn't have value, but attached to Goff, you have value not just as, one of the top 3 or 4 receivers on the depth chart, but also you have leverage if guys get hurt. Like if Jamison Williams just never comes back this season, for example, for some reason, like maybe he gambles on the NFL again, or he gets hurt, or whatever not.
Yeah.
Then that Khalif Raymond is not only going to have more value, but it's going to be so unique. Like it's like in a large field, no one else is really going to have it. So that's something to think about. Like you can roster a guy that you would otherwise never take if you have a quarterback stacked and maybe you only have one of his other receivers, or even if you have 2, there's just a lot more options. So you don't have to restrict yourself to like trying to reach for these guys at these certain spots in the draft early. Like you could, a lot of times the best stacks are the ones that are just going to be so off the board that no one would even ever think that they would have any correlation or upside. And that's how you're really gonna to win in these larger field tournaments. All right. Anything else? Any other guys that you want to talk about, or are we out of here?
I think we're out of here. I think we're good. I think we covered everything.
Yeah. Oh, and draft Tyler Higbee. He's going too well. Not he's
Yeah.
he's not a high ADOT guy, but
now that we have our two favorites, Chig and Dulcich, have had rough past couple weeks. Tyler Higbee is sticking out like a sore thumb, so he is definitely my most drafted tight end the past week.
Oh, and another interesting one. We've seen what Dalton Schultz has done in Dallas, and we've talked about on the last pod how Ferguson has a chance to take over the entire Schultz role, not just be in a three-way committee. So if you have Dak, you can go Dak, Cooks, Gallup, Ferguson, or Dak. Gallup's going like wide receiver 50, I think, and Ferguson is obviously going way low. So Dak is the earliest guy you have to draft. So like those situations too, because we've seen Dak with a ton of upside. We don't exactly know how it's going to play out with Schottenheimer and McCarthy calling plays, but Dak does have upside. And, if he throws like 8-9 touchdowns to Ferguson and you also have Gallup or Cooks who are, getting some deep balls, you could be in business. So it doesn't just have to be the number one receiver. You could get leverage, like if the number one gets hurt or something like that. So a lot of different ways to stack, but the bottom line, get creative, stay cheap, and don't screw up your first, the high leverage rounds of your draft by like reaching for stacks. Like you don't need a Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins to win your draft because too many other people are probably going to try to do the same thing and everyone's just going to screw each other over. So like if you have a better plan of just drafting for value early, getting these cheaper guys late, stacking them up for the correlation more often than not. Like it's not always going to work. No strategy is foolproof, but it's going to be a better strategy to differentiate yourself. All right, that's going to wrap it up for the Fantasy Flex Best Ball 2023 preview episode. You could find Sean on Twitter, X, whatever it's called.
Whatever it is.
At @_oddsmaker. I'm at Chris Raybon. We're at those same handles. On the Action app where you could track all of your bets or follow ours, whatever you want to do, combination of the two. And be sure to check out our fantasy rankings up at actionnetwork.com, and we will be back next week. Until then, let's get this money.